They needed a human at the table, and I was the human they had. That is the whole of how it happened, though the Chavern would later build it into something with more weight, the way they build weight into everything. I was the liaison clerk at Tal Osric. My job was manifests. I counted what came aboard and what left. I stamped the count. I filed the count. And when the counts disagreed, I found out why they disagreed and made a note. 41 years of that, most of it on human stations, the last 6 on this one, wedged into a Chavern precinct because somebody on the treaty side decided the two species ought to rub along in the same corridors and learn each other's manners. I had learned theirs. Their manners were mostly about the game. You could not spend an hour on Tal Osric without the game. The Chavern called it Kess, and I will call it that, because the word they used for it in their own throats was a long, soft thing I could never make my mouth do. Kess was a board. That undersells it the way calling the ocean water undersells it, but it was a board, tiered like a wedding cake turned by a drunk, 9 levels of it, and pieces that moved between the levels along rules I will not pretend I ever fully held, and it was the axis their whole society turned on. A Chavern's rank was their game rank. Their courts were game halls. Their history was a list of famous positions the way ours is a list of famous battles, and to them there was no difference between the two, because a battle was just a position you were too stupid to have resigned 3 moves earlier. They did not think humans could play it. That was not an insult to them. It was a fact filed and stamped, the way I would file that a crate weighed what it weighed. Humans were shallow. That was the word that came back through the translators over and over in a dozen polite shapes. Shallow. A human mind, they had decided, could hold 1 move, maybe 2, and then it fell off the edge of itself and had to start again. A 1-move species. They said it without heat. They said it the way you would say a dog cannot read. It was not cruel. It was just the shape of the world to them, and they were comfortable in the shape. So when the treaty calendar came around to what the translators rendered as the convening, a tournament near enough, that the precinct held every long cycle and that drew Chavern from other holds to play, and to watch somebody on their side had the notion that it would be a fine gesture of goodwill to seat a human at the low tables. A courtesy. Let the shallow species have a chair. It would cost them nothing, and it would be, I understood clearly, entertaining. The human they had was me. I want to be honest about my own feelings here, because the whole thing turns on how little I had. I was not offended. I have been a clerk for a long time, and you do not stay a clerk for a long time if you are the kind of man who gets offended by being underestimated. Being underestimated is comfortable. It is a chair nobody is fighting you for. When Undermarker Cell came to my counter to deliver the invitation, and she delivered it herself, which I later understood was itself a small courtesy, a superior coming down to the clerk's window, she was gentle about it, the way you are gentle telling a child the race is just for fun. You will not be expected to win, she told me. Cell was young for her rank, quick with the flatter crest that meant she had come up fast and knew it. Her honesty was the honest kind, not the cutting kind. You will not be expected to understand. You will be expected to sit and to move when it is your turn, and the hall will be glad you came. Do you see? I see, I said. High Adjudicator Vosk has approved it, she said, and there was a small weight on the name, the weight you put on a thing you are proud of and a little afraid of at once. He does not usually approve novelties. He said it would be good for the young ones to watch a mind that cannot go deep, as a lesson, in gratitude, I think, for what they have. That's kind of him, I said, and meant it flatly enough that she took it as agreement, which was easier for both of us. She left me the rules. That is the part nobody accounts for when they tell the story now, and it is the only part that matters. She left me the rules. A courtesy again. You would not send a man to a table without the rules, even a man you expected to drown at it. It came as a slab, a Chavern reading slab, and when I asked the station system to render it into something I could read at my own pace, it turned out to be long. Not long the way a manual is long. Long the way a body of law is long. The rules of Kess ran to a length that I, a man who has read a great many manifests and a great many manuals, and the fine print on a great many bonded shipments, found frankly familiar. It was a document that had been added to for a very long time by people who did not throw anything away. I read it. I want to be plain about why, because it was not cunning and it was not pride. It was habit. I'm a man who reads the whole document. I have watched fortunes and reputations go over the side because somebody read to the exciting part and stopped, and I have made a modest, unglamorous living being the man who did not stop. When a shipment goes wrong, the answer is never in the part everybody read. It is in Clause 31, subsection 4, the part that is boring because it was written by a tired person to cover a case that had not come up yet and everyone assumed never would. I did not read the rules of Kess to master Kess. I could no more master Kess in a fortnight than I could grow a second heart. I read them because when you hand me a document and tell me I am about to be bound by it, I read it, all of it, to the end. It took me the better part of 3 off shifts. The middle of it was the part the Chavern loved, the grand movement of the game, the deep branching heart of it, the captures and the counter-captures, and the long lines of forced play that their commentators would recite the way our old men recite the endings of wars. I understood perhaps a fifth of it, and I do not think I flatter myself with the fifth. I passed through it the way you pass through a cathedral in a language you don't speak, respectful and lost. And then I got to the back, the appendix, the part after the part everybody stops at. There was a great deal back there. Rulings on edge cases centuries old. Notes on positions that had been argued and settled and were now dead law that nobody invoked because nobody played that way anymore. Definitions of terms that had fallen out of use. It was, in every particular, the fine print, and I read the fine print the way I always read the fine print, slowly, with a stylus, making the small marks I make. And near the very back, in a section on what the translation rendered as terminations, how a game of Kess could end, there was a clause about the count. I will give it to you the way I came to understand it, though it took me a second and a third reading and one careful question to a translation program to be sure I had it. A game of Kess ended in the way everyone knew when a player captured the opponent's sovereign piece off the top tier. That was the win the whole game was built to produce, the glorious win, the one the commentators lived for. But the game also, the rules said, had a bounded length. There was a count of turns, a long one, longer than almost any real game ran, so long that in ordinary play it never came near mattering, and if the count expired with no sovereign taken, the game did not draw. It did not void. It was settled. It was settled by the board. Whoever held more of the board when the count ran out, more tiers, more standing pieces, by a reckoning the clause laid out carefully and dryly, that player won. They called it, in the old word the appendix used, the ledger. I read it 3 times. Then I set the slab down and sat with it for a while in the quiet of my quarters, the way you sit with a discrepancy in a manifest when you have found it but not yet understood what it means. Because here is what it meant, and I want to lay it out plainly, because it is the whole engine of the thing. Nobody played for the ledger. I could tell that without being told, and I confirmed it later, and the confirming was its own small comedy. To win by the ledger was, to a Chavern, not really to win. It was the outcome of a game where neither player had the depth or the courage to force the true finish, and the board simply had to be counted like, and I used their own translated word when I finally asked like inventory. It was the clerk's ending, the coward's ledger. It was in the rules the way an old, embarrassing law is in a nation's books, technically alive, universally ignored, a thing you did not do because you were not the kind of person who did that. In the entire recorded history of the convening, the translation program told me, when I asked it, the ledger had not decided a game in over 400 of their years. They had forgotten it was there. Not literally, a scholar would have known, but in the way that matters, the way a thing is forgotten when everyone agrees it does not count. They had read to the good part and stopped, for 400 years. I am a clerk. Counting inventory is not, to me, a shameful way to end anything. It is how most things end that I have ever had a hand in. I sat there in my quarters and I thought about the tournament, and the low tables, and the long count that never came near mattering, and I did a small clerk's arithmetic, the kind I have done 10,000 times, the kind about what a thing actually requires versus what everybody assumes it requires. To take a sovereign off the ninth tier, I would need to be able to play chess, and I could not. To hold more of the board than the other fellow when a very long clock ran out, I would need to not lose my pieces, and to be very, very patient, and to not care in the slightest what anyone in the room thought of me while I did it. I was, it seemed to me, extraordinarily well suited to the second thing. The convening opened 3 shifts later in the long hall. I had been in the long hall before, to deliver things, but never during a convening, and it was another room entirely when it was full. The Chavern do not cheer. They attend. The hall rose in tiers around the tables the way their boards rose in tiers, and it filled silently, with row on row of them settling into place with that folding, deliberate way they have, and the attention that came off them was a physical pressure. A whole room of minds turned to one purpose, and the purpose was the game. There were many tables. The great ones were at the center and the low ones ringed the outside, and I was at a low one, of course, at the outermost ring, and around my table there gathered exactly the small crowd you would expect for a novelty. The young ones Vosk had spoken of, the ones who had come to watch a shallow mind drown, plus a few older ones drawn by the same thing that draws older men to any freak show, which is the pleasure of being confirmed in what they already knew. High Adjudicator Vosk opened the convening. I will not pretend I followed the whole of what he said. The translation came to me a beat behind in the flat station voice, and ceremony does not translate well. But the heart of it came through. He spoke about the game as the measure of a mind. He spoke about depth, that word again, as the thing that separated the peoples who mattered from the peoples who did not, and he did not once look at my table when he said it, which was its own kind of looking. And then, near the end, he made the gesture toward the human at the low table, the gesture of welcome, and the hall turned to me for a moment, and he said the thing that got repeated afterward, the thing that I suppose started it all. Let the young remember, he said, or the flat voice said for him, that we honor even the shallow water. It cannot help its shallowness. We do not scorn the puddle for failing to be the sea. We are glad it came to sit at the edge of the sea, so that the young may see the difference with their own eyes. It got a response from the hall. Not a laugh, they do not laugh like we do, but a settling, a warmth, a rustle of agreement and affection. He was a good speaker. He had given the young ones a kindness to feel and a superiority to feel at the same time, which is the whole trick of it, and he had done it without ever raising his voice or saying a single cruel word. I filed him at that moment as a formidable man. I did not revise that later. He remained a formidable man. That is part of why the story is worth telling. It is not the story of a fool. Then they sat me down to play. My first opponent was a young Chavern named Retta, so far as I could make the name, low-ranked, chosen I think because pairing me with anyone real would have been an insult to the real player. Retta was nervous. I could tell even across the species barrier. There is a nervousness that reads on anything alive. Retta had been given the puddle to drown and did not, I think, entirely enjoy the assignment, being young enough to still feel the edge of unkindness in it. We played and I lost. I want to be clear that I lost, and lost properly, and lost fast, that first game because it matters. I did not come to the table with a trick already turning. I came to the table having read the rules, which is a different thing entirely, and the first game I found out what reading the rules is worth against someone who has lived inside them, which is not much, not yet. Retta took me apart. I made legal moves, I had the rules, so my moves were legal, which itself surprised the little crowd, who I think had expected me to fumble even that, but legal is a low bar. And Retta played me off the board with room to spare and took my sovereign in a fashion that drew a soft, warm rustle of approval from the watchers. The lesson had gone as planned. The puddle was a puddle. But I had noticed something while I drowned, and I noticed it precisely because I was not trying to win the way Retta was trying to win. I was watching the clock. Every game of chess ran its turn count. It ran up in a corner of the board, a rising number, and no one looked at it ever because it never mattered, because every real game ended 100 marks of the count before it could come near the bound. The count was scenery. It was the mile markers on a road nobody drove to the end of. And I, sitting there losing, had all the attention in the world to spend on scenery, because I was not spending any of it on winning the real way, which I could not do. So I watched the count, and I watched how much of it a real, deep, glorious game actually used, and it used almost none of it. The bound was enormous. A Chavern game was a sprint that ended in a beautiful death. The count was built for a marathon nobody ran. I lost my first game and I stood up from the table, and I made the small bow the rules prescribed for a defeated player, and Retta made the larger bow of a victor, and the little crowd was satisfied. And I went and got what passed for coffee on Tal Osric, and I sat with my scenery. Because a convening is not one game. That is the other thing I had read, in the part about the structure of the thing, the part that also was not the exciting part. A convening was a long ladder of games. You did not lose once and go home. You lost and dropped and played again lower, and the very bottom of the ladder, the part they had put me on, was a slow churn of many games among the low players over many shifts, precisely because at the bottom nobody mattered enough to be eliminated quickly. They wanted the lowest tables full for the whole convening, as a kind of continuous ground floor entertainment beneath the great games above. I would get to play a great many games of chess before this was over. I would get, in other words, a great many turns of practice at not losing my pieces. I lost my second game too, and my third, but something had changed in how I lost them, and the young Chavern across from me each time felt it before the watchers did, the way the man in the ring feels the change before the crowd. I had stopped trying to play chess. I had understood, somewhere in the drowning, that I would never play chess, that the deep branching heart of it was closed to me forever, and that this was fine because I did not need it. I only needed two things. I needed to not have my sovereign taken, and I needed to still have pieces on the board when the count came up. So I stopped attacking. Entirely. I have never in my life been a natural attacker of anything. I'm a man who checks a manifest, not a man who storms a gate, and the game let me be exactly what I was. I pulled my pieces back. I made a knot of them, low on the board, around my sovereign, a dull, ugly defensive knot that no Chavern would ever have made because it went nowhere and threatened nothing and was, to their eyes, the play of a mind with no ambition and no shame. And it was hard to break. Not because I was clever. I was not clever. I could not see 3 moves down the branching tree to save my life. But because a knot is a stupid, sturdy thing, and my opponents were young, and they had been raised to win beautifully and had never once in their lives had to grind down an ugly knot that did not want anything, because no Chavern had ever made one, because it was beneath them. I lost my third game late, much later than I should have, late enough that the watchers noticed. I lost my fourth game later still, and did not lose my sovereign until the very end of it. And that game I looked at the count when it was over and I saw how far up it had climbed. And I did my clerk's arithmetic again. And I lost my fifth game not at all. I want to tell that one properly because it was the first, and because Sel was watching, which turned out to matter. My fifth opponent was a Chavern of middling rank named Dawn, older than the young ones, put across from me, I think, because the young ones had started, quietly, to not enjoy playing the human any more. Something had gotten into the low tables. The human did not drown the way a puddle should. The human sank slowly and unpleasantly, like a stone through mud, and taking his sovereign had begun to be work, and work at the low tables was not what anyone had signed up for. So they gave me Dawn, who was solid and dull and would grind me flat. Dawn and I played the longest game of that ring that shift. I made my knot. Dawn, being older and more patient than the young ones, settled in to break it, and he was good, and slowly he did break it piece by piece, and I gave the pieces up in the order that cost me least, which I had gotten better at, and I watched the count climb. And a strange thing happened, which was that as the count climbed, Dahl's task changed under him without his noticing. Early in a game, breaking a knot to reach a sovereign is a chore with all the time in the world. Late in a game, with the count high, it becomes a race, and a race against a bound you have never once in your life had to think about is a different animal than a chore. Dahl had never had to think about the count. No Chavern had. And so Dahl did not think about it and ground forward at his solid, dull pace, dismantling my knot with plenty of time, right up until there was not plenty of time, and then there was very little time, and then the count came up. I still had 11 pieces on the board and my sovereign in its corner. Dahl had more than 11. He had been winning, in the only sense he understood, but more than 11 is not how the ledger reckons. The ledger reckons the board by its own careful dry arithmetic of tiers held and pieces standing and lines controlled, and by that arithmetic, when the count came up, I held more of the board than Dahl did. My ugly knot held its low tiers entire. Dahl's forces were spread up the board in the shape of an attack that had not quite finished, and an unfinished attack is a poor thing to be caught holding when someone starts counting. The count came up, and nothing happened because nobody in the hall knew what was supposed to happen. The board simply sat there with its number full. I stood and I made the small bow, but I made the victor's bow, the larger one, the one Retta had made over me the first shift. And into the silence, in my flat clerk's voice, I said the word the rules gave me. I said, the ledger, or the long, soft version of it I had practiced saying badly in my quarters. I have thought a great deal since about the quality of the silence that followed. It was not the silence of a room that has seen a trick. It was the silence of a room that has heard a word it knows but has not heard aloud in living memory, spoken correctly, in the right place, by the wrong mouth. Dahl did not understand at first. He looked at me and looked at the board and looked at the count, and I watched him travel the whole distance, from certainty that I had made some pathetic error through the slow reading of the count, to the place where he arrived at the appendix in his own memory. The dead law, the coward's ending, the thing that was in the rules and did not count, and understood that it was in the rules and that the count was full, and that by the reckoning of the ledger, coward's ending or not, he had lost. Dahl was not a young man and he did not disgrace himself. He sat very still for a moment. Then he made slowly the defeated player's bow, the small one, and I do not think a smaller bow had ever cost anyone in that hall more, and I respected him for it and let my own face stay flat, because the last thing on earth I was going to do was gloat. I had won a game of inventory. That is nothing to crow about. I file inventory for a living. But Sel had been watching, and Sel understood before Dahl did, because Sel was quick and because Sel, I would learn, was one of the few Chavern alive who had actually read the appendix, being the sort of ferocious young climber who reads everything, because she means to leave nothing on the table on her way up. And what Sel did when she understood was the thing that changed the temperature of the whole convening. She made a sound. I had never heard a Chavern laugh. I am not certain even now that it was a laugh in the sense we mean. It was a short, sharp, ratcheting sound, and every crest in her vicinity turned toward it as though she had drawn a weapon, and she did not stop making it. And slowly I understood that whatever it was the sound of a mind that had just been shown something delightful and could not help itself. She was looking at the board, and at me, and at Dahl's ruined attack sitting there full of ambition with nowhere to go, and she was making the ratcheting sound, and it was not cruel toward Dahl exactly, and it was not warm toward me exactly. It was the sound of somebody enjoying enormously a joke that had been sitting in the rules for 400 years waiting for a mind shallow enough to actually read to the end and find it. That was the 5th game. After that, they stopped giving me the low tables because I had become the most interesting thing at the convening, and the Chavern, whatever else they are, do not turn away from an interesting thing at a convening. They gave me better opponents, and here is the part that I think Vosk never entirely forgave, though he was too formidable a man to show it. The better opponents did not fix the problem. They made it worse. Because a better Chavern player attacks better. A better player builds a more beautiful, more forceful, more inevitable assault on your sovereign. And a more forceful assault, played against my ugly patient knot, used more of the board, committed more pieces upward, and left more of that beautiful commitment stranded and countable when the clock ran out. The deeper they went, the more they had invested in the count they were not watching. My knot did not get better. It did not need to get better. It only needed to survive, and to still be holding its low tiers when someone said the word. And against a great player it survived worse, but the count fell harder, and the two came out, again and again, to about the same place. I lost some. I want to be honest that I lost some. A truly great player could sometimes break the knot and take my sovereign before the count, cleanly, the real way, and when they did I bowed the small bow and meant it. But I won more than a puddle has any business winning, and every one I won by the ledger, and every time I said the word the room went to that same silence, and every time from somewhere in the tiers, Cell made her ratcheting sound. Word of it climbed the hall the way water finds its level. By the third shift of it, there were Chavern coming from the great center tables between their own games to stand at the edge of mine, and watch the human hold his knot and count the board. And their faces, I had gotten better at their faces, were doing something complicated. There was scorn in it still, plenty of scorn. The scorn of a people watching their sacred thing won in the ugliest possible way by someone who plainly could not play it. But underneath the scorn there was the other thing. The thing that scorn turns into when it cannot make the ugly result stop happening, which is unease. And underneath the unease, in the quick ones like Cell, there was something that was nearly respect and was certainly not comfortable. Because the thing they were watching, if they let themselves see it, was this. A mind they had filed as too shallow to hold the game had found the one thing in the game that shallowness was good for. I could not go deep. So I had gone to the back. And the back, it turned out, was undefended, because for 400 years everyone deep enough to matter had been too proud to go there. Vosk let it run 4 shifts before he sat down across from me himself. I understood what it was when it was arranged. You did not draw the high adjudicator by climbing a ladder. I had not climbed any ladder. I had been shuffled sideways into being a spectacle. Vosk chose to play me, and he chose it in front of the fullest hall of the convening, on the great center board, with every tier of the long hall attended and silent, and I understood without anyone telling me that this was the correction. The lesson had gone wrong. The puddle had embarrassed the sea for 4 shifts, by a trick of the rules, and now the sea itself would sit down and demonstrate, in front of everyone, the difference the young had been brought here to see. He would beat me. He would beat me before the count came anywhere near, cleanly, deeply, beautifully, and he would take my sovereign the true way, and the ratcheting sound would stop, and the world would go back into its proper shape. And I want to tell you honestly, he could have. That is the thing I have never let anyone soften when they tell it back to me. Vosk was the best chess player on that station and likely one of the best alive, and there was nothing in my ugly knot that a mind of that depth could not, in principle, take apart before the clock. The correct outcome of Vosk sitting down across from me was Vosk winning, cleanly, the real way, long before the ledger could ever come into it. I knew that when I sat down. I sat down anyway, and made my knot anyway, because it was the only thing I had, and because a clerk does not decline to file the return merely because he expects to lose the audit. We played on the great board, and I will not pretend to narrate the deep parts, because I did not follow the deep parts, and to pretend I did would be a worse lie than any the Chavern told themselves. What I can tell you is the shape of it from inside my own small competence, which is all I ever had. Vosk did not rush. That was the first thing, and it was the thing I had feared most, because the players who beat me were the ones who understood that against my knot the enemy was time, not the knot, and who spent their depth on the clock instead of on the board. If Vosk had played fast, had thrown his whole terrible depth at breaking me quickly, before the count could gather, I think he takes my sovereign in the middle third of the game, and none of this is a story anyone tells. But Vosk did not play to beat me. That is the thing I understood only slowly, sitting there giving up my pieces in the order that cost me least. Vosk played to beat me beautifully. He was not merely dismantling the human. He was giving a lecture, to the fullest hall of the convening, on the depth of the true game, and a lecture takes time. And every move that made his position more beautiful and more instructive and more complete also committed one more piece one tier higher up the board, into the shape of a masterwork that wanted the whole depth of the game to finish. And that had not the faintest interest in the shabby little number, climbing in the corner that no one in 400 years had lowered themselves to watch. I watched the number. I gave up pieces. I held my low tiers. I made no move that was not the dullest available move, and the hall's scorn washed over me in waves, and somewhere above me I could feel the young ones being shown, at last, the lesson they had been promised. See how the deep mind plays. See how it is beautiful. See how the shallow one merely cowers and clings. And it was true. I was merely cowering and clinging. That was the entire content of my game, and I have never once claimed otherwise. I cowered and clung, and I watched the number, and the number climbed, and Vosk built his cathedral one perfect committed stone at a time, higher and higher up the board, and did not look at the number, because he was the high adjudicator of Tal Osric, and he had not looked at that number in 40 years, and he was not going to start looking at it in front of the young. The Count came up with his masterwork, one move from complete. I have wondered since whether he saw it in the last few marks. I think he must have. Vosk was too deep a mind not to feel, at the very end, the cold coming off the corner of the board where the number was. I think in the last handful of moves some part of him did the arithmetic I had done in my quarters a lifetime ago, and saw where his beautiful committed pieces were stranded, and saw where my ugly knot still sat holding its low tiers entire, and understood, one or two moves too late to matter, that he had built his cathedral in a field that was about to be counted. I think he saw it. And I think this is the part I respect, and the part that keeps him from being a fool in the telling. I think he chose to finish the move he was making rather than break the beauty of it to scrabble for the count like a clerk. I think he decided, in that last mark, that he would rather lose the game the ugly way than win it the ugly way. I cannot prove that. But I have sat across a table from a great many people at the moment the audit turns against them, and I know the difference between a man who does not see it coming and a man who sees it and will not flinch, and Vosk did not flinch. The Count came up full. I stood and I made the victor's bow, and into the great silence of the fullest hall of the convening I said the word, the ledger. I said it as well as I have ever said it, which is not very well, and it did not matter, because everyone in that hall knew exactly what word it was. I will not tell you the hall erupted, because the cavern do not erupt. I will tell you that for the length of several breaths, the long hall of Kes held the deepest silence I have ever stood inside, a silence with a whole species in it, and that the silence was doing a very great deal of work. And then from up in the tiers, one clear ratcheting sound, Sell, of course, Sell who had read the appendix, Sell who had known since the fifth game exactly where this ended, one sharp delighted ratcheting sound, alone in all that silence, and then slowly from here and there across the hall, others taking it up, until a good part of the young of Tal Osric were making the sound they made when a thing was too delightful to hold in. At the spectacle of their high adjudicator's masterwork sitting, stranded and beautiful, and counted on the great board, beaten by a puddle who had read to the end. Vosk sat very still through all of it. Then he did the thing that told me the whole of what kind of man he was, which was that he raised one hand, and the ratcheting stopped, everywhere, at once. His authority was that entire even in defeat, and into the returned silence he asked me a question. The flat station voice gave it to me a beat behind. You cannot play, he said. It was not quite a question. You held 11 pieces in a corner and made no true move in the whole of the game. You cannot play Kes. No, I said, I can't. Then how? Said the high adjudicator. and I want you to understand there was no rage in it. Only the terrible flat curiosity of a very deep mind that has been shown its own blind spot and means to look straight at it. Does a mind that cannot play the game defeat the mind that plays it best? The hall waited. Sel, up in the tiers, had gone still and forward, and I understood that this was the real question of the whole convening, the one the young had actually been brought here to have answered, though nobody had known it would be this answer. I could have made it into something. I want to be honest that the opening was there. I could have said something about the shallow water finding the deep man's blind side, something with a shape to it, something the translators would have carried up into the tiers, and that would have made the young one sound and made me, for a moment, large. I have thought since about the man who would have said that. I do not think I would have liked him. I am a clerk, so I told him the plain thing, which was also the true thing. You stopped reading, I said. The rules on the last page, I read the last page. That was all. I did not explain the count, or the knot, or the 400 years. A mind like Vosk's did not need it explained, and a mind unlike his would not have been helped by it. I told him where the rule was and that I had read it and he had not, and I let it sit there flat on the great board, next to his stranded masterwork. Vosk looked at me for a long moment. And then the high adjudicator of Tal Osric did a thing I have never seen a Chavern do before or since, which was that he inclined his head to me. Not the defeated player's small bow, which is a thing of the game, but a different motion, slower, that the translators later told me had no fixed meaning in their ceremony, and was therefore something he had chosen rather than performed. A private motion. I have decided in the years since that it meant something like noted, filed. He was a man who understood, better than anyone in that hall, exactly what had been done to him and exactly how small and how enormous it was, and he did me the courtesy of not pretending it away. Then Sel came down out of the tiers, which a superior did not do, and came to the edge of the great board, and made her ratcheting sound one more time quieter, and said the thing that I think is the true end of it, the thing I have carried longer than any of the rest. 400 years, she said, the rule sat there, we wrote it, we kept it, we read past it every time. She looked at the stranded masterwork and at my ugly counted knot and at me. You were not deeper than us. You were only willing to be the clerk. And she made the sound again, softer, and I understood that in her mouth, at least, being the clerk had stopped being an insult somewhere in the last few shifts, and had become something closer to the highest thing she knew how to say to me. Somebody has to read the back, I said. It might as well be the fellow who reads the manifests. They changed the rules after. Not to close the ledger, this is the part I like best, and it is why I trust that Vosk was a serious man and not a proud one. They did not close it. They could have. One line in the appendix and my whole ugly trick was dead law again. Instead, the convening the following cycle opened with the high adjudicator reading the rule aloud, the whole rule, front to back, appendix and all, to the assembled hall, so that no player of chess would ever again go up to a great board not knowing what was written on the last page. Vosk read it himself. Sel told me he read it himself every cycle after, until he stepped down. He turned the thing that beat him into a ceremony about not stopping at the good part, and made it a permanent feature of their most sacred hall, and I have never in my life received a compliment I valued more, and it was not addressed to me, and my name was never spoken in it. I went back to my counter. I still count what comes aboard and what leaves. Sel sends a message now and again, when a young player finds some other dead thing in the appendix and drags it into the light, and she always tells me, and she always ends it with the little written mark that I have decided is the written form of her ratcheting sound. The young ones at Tal Osric do not call humans shallow anymore, or not where I can hear it, which is the same thing for a clerk. And once, months after, one of the young ones who had been brought to the convening to see the difference with their own eyes, stopped at my counter and asked me shyly, in halting station standard, whether it was true that I had never once made a real move in the whole of the game against the high adjudicator. Not one, I said. The young Chavern took this in and turned it over, the way they turn everything over, and then asked the only question that had ever really been the question, from the very first shift, when Cell left the rules on my counter as a courtesy she did not know was a mistake. Then how did you know you could win? I didn't, I said. I read the whole thing and I found out I couldn't lose it as fast as you thought. The rest was just waiting for the count. And I stamped the manifest in front of me and filed it because it was the end of my shift, and the young one went away to think about it and I went home. That is the whole of it. They needed a human at the table and I was the human they had, and I read to the end. Most people stop at the good part. That has never once in 41 years been my problem.